evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar that's about the Retirement Perfect Storm. It's kind of a building. If you've been to some of our other webinars, you'll know that there's a common theme here, and some of it is, what you might be wanting to think about when it comes to your long-term financial planning, what you're doing for your retirement. And what I'd like to do tonight is kind of present you with some of the things that drive me, some of the things that make us realize that this retirement blueprinting process is really important, why people should do it. And it's a little bit of three things, as I mentioned in the invite. There's a little bit about taxation. We have to talk about that. That's absolutely a critical part of our future. And again, I'm speaking from a baby boomer to, I know most of you out there are baby boomers. So the taxation issue is a big issue. We have to be thinking and talking about that. Number two, we got to worry about the bubble. And I know that many people kind of want to believe that no matter how bad the news is, things will only get better. And I just can't, for the life of me, understand how it's doing what it's doing. How is it inflating more? And I have some things that I think you're going to find interesting that I use to put together my thoughts to present to you tonight. And then the last thing is something that I talked about on the last webinar, which is a behavior aspect of this. And I'm going to urge you to think a little bit outside the box that you've been in since you started accumulating all your funds. I want you to think about, are you properly equipped? Do you have the right people in your life right now? Do you have two people? Do you have a triangle of decision-making process? Things like that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint presentation with you tonight. I want to start with the perfect storm. And again, I'm a weather buff, so I kind of understand the elements of a perfect storm. So I wanted to take that and then try to build off the comparison of the perfect storm, the weather phenomenon, with what I believe could be the financial phenomena that will potentially derail a lot of our retirement. So we're talking about the retirement perfect storm here, and I do believe a retirement perfect storm is gathering, and I do believe that I would be someone that could be greatly affected by it. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the storm and then a lot about the financial aspect of why I believe there is a retirement perfect storm in the making. So let's start with the weather phenomena first, right? I find this incredibly interesting. This storm was something that never happened before in at least weather keeping records, and it may never happen again as long as I live. So the perfect storm, the weather phenomenon, basically started with a hurricane that formed way up in the North Atlantic, where hurricanes rarely are found, but hardly ever form there. So Hurricane Grace was the name of this hurricane. And this hurricane, and this is back in, I think, 1991 is when this happened. This hurricane, instead of just drifting off and upwards and into the Canadian Maritime, it didn't do that. Instead, it kind of followed that pattern that brought it back over to the coast of the United States. And that was because there was a high-pressure system that forced it backwards instead of letting it run its normal course off to the east. Well, at the same time, a large nor'easter. Now, for anyone living in the Northeast, and I'm in New York, so we get nor'easters, and they're powerful storms, and sometimes they can be as powerful as a hurricane. Well, as Grace became just a weather system, no longer a hurricane, her energy got wrapped up into this low pressure system off the Carolina coast, and then it moved off into the warm water. And when it did that, it became a hurricane again. But unfortunately, we'd never had in history a hurricane essentially die, and then come back to life again. And that's what happened. So as the hurricane then became a hurricane again, they didn't know to call it Grace 2. They just basically didn't name the storm, but it was as powerful as a hurricane that would come up the coast normally. So they called it the perfect storm, and it was a powerhouse, but it is the makings of the movie. That's the one with George Clooney and I think Mark Wahlberg were in, among other wonderful actors. So that was the ingredients that caused this thing to be called the perfect storm. So why am I saying that there's a possibility that a retirement storm could be gathering? Well, let's look at the same three type of ingredients that I think are coming together that we should all be very aware of. And again, this is about awareness. It's not about a scare tactic. I will present facts for you like a weather forecaster. And when it can come together, I have no idea, but we ought to know about this and we should be thinking about it. So let's talk about the fuel for the retirement perfect storm. What would it be? Well, for me, the biggest part of this is the national debt. I really believe that with where we are, and at the end of this, I have a slide that I built specifically after listening to Senator Rand Paul. So the national debt. So let's take a look at the national debt. This number's off, by the way. It is one of the hardest things to put in a presentation because it moves so quickly. We are over 27 trillion. I think we're over 700 billion now. So we're on our way to $28 trillion really, really quick. So I wanted to see, well, how much, right? How's this gotten to be so large? How does this happen? Well, in 2000, the national debt was $5,600 billion. Now, if you think about that, if you take everything from the coronavirus starting to where we'll probably be at the end of this year, we may run that kind of money into our current debt. And that's what took until the year 2000 to create. From Lincoln to 2000, $5 trillion. We may add that in 2021. Remarkable number. So the increase is $21,892 billion. We can't ignore this anymore, and I'm going to make that argument of why you should be thinking about this and not just saying it's some crazy number. It just can't be looked at that way, guys, because when this storm comes together, you don't want to be the person that didn't buy flood insurance, right? So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has forecasted by 2030 that the national debt will be $31 trillion. I'm going to say today on the record that I think that's going to be $40 trillion. I don't see how we could possibly go from 2021 at 28 trillion and only add 3 trillion more in 9 more years. It doesn't make sense. I think the CBO is going to put out new numbers this year, and I do believe it's going to encroach on $40 trillion by the end of 2030. Now, remember that because I'm going to start answering or talking a little bit more about the cost of this debt. So I always like to do this, and if you've been to other webinars that I've done, I show this because I find it incredibly interesting. So I actually brought this series of doing this over multiple webinars to a head because I got to the end of 2020, so I wanted to do the summary. So as we go down the list of presidents, you can see the ramp. It's growing bigger every year. We usually talk about how it goes from double-digit billions to triple-digit billions to into the trillions under Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, double-digit trillions. Then we go into Barack Obama. He still gets the 2 asterisks to the right, which means he is going to maintain and hold the record of the administration that added the most dollars to the national debt. And that's because Donald Trump's legacy will show him adding at least $27,747 billion, and that was as of the end of this year. So when you look at that, and you look at the difference between Obama and Trump, Trump had 4 years in service. Obama had 8. But the pattern just keeps showing that we're headed towards a very, very big day of reckoning. So here's the problem with all of this. We don't understand what $1 trillion is. $1 trillion is such a massive number that I saw a video where they took $100 bills and they smashed them together flat, right? And they said if you put them in Cincinnati and mesh them flat, you could make it stretch all the way to Miami, Florida, and it would take 16 hours to drive past it at 60 miles an hour. That's $1 trillion. But let's talk about $1 billion, right? Because even $1 billion is a big number for us to think about. So if $1 trillion is 1,000 billions, let's look at $1 billion. So this was the video I referred to earlier. I will play this in its entirety at the end of this webinar. I'll leave it open. I'll be off camera, and you can watch this if you're interested. But I'm going to steal his thunder right now. So what's $1 billion? So Rand Paul, who I think is one of the few senators that actually gets what's going on in this world, he basically said if you take $1 billion, to understand $1 billion seconds ago, Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States and we were in 1988. If you take $1 billion minutes ago, Jesus walked the shores of the Sea of Galilee. If you take $1 billion hours ago, man still lived in caves. This is how large a billion is, seconds, minutes, hours. But in terms of the United States national debt, what's $1 billion? 81 minutes ago, that is what's got to get in our heads. We've got to recognize that everything that we see, everything we want to believe, this cannot be ignored if you're going to have the retirement lifestyle that you believe and you expect and you deserve. So remember this. I will play the video at the end. Here's why that matters. If you take the U.S. net interest expense, that is the amount of money that the United States will lose between its investments that it earns money and the interest that it has to pay on its debts. So the difference between it is the net interest expense. Now, we're using that same 2030 number here. Now, remember, I think it's going to be more like 40 trillion, but let's go with what the CBO has right now at $31 trillion. If that holds, we will pay out $819 billion in an interest-only type of expense, right? We're not paying down the debt. We just have to pay the interest so we don't default on our debt. And this money is owed to other people. It's not the government owing money to itself. This money is owed to other people, so the interest checks have to be written. So let's look at that number, right? Let's take $819 billion. So $819 billion, the average U.S. taxpayer pays about $15,000 a year in federal income tax. So let's just say in 2030, how many volunteers do we need to pay $15,000 a year, that year, to pay the $819 billion, which I think will be closer to $1 trillion. So what is that number? It's 54,600,000 people. That's why these numbers are so crazy, right? They're so big. 54,600,000 taxpayers. So how do we break that down into something that makes sense? Well, here's how I did it. I had the good fortune of taking a trip down to AT&T Stadium, home of the Dallas Cowboys. One of the most beautiful stadiums. You don't have to be a Cowboys fan to love that stadium. That is an impressive, impressive place to be. You could eat off the floor. So if we took AT&T Stadium, why did I pick that? Because it's one of the few professional sports venues that holds 100,000 people. Nice round number. So if AT&T Stadium holds 100,000 people, and at their max capacity, if every person coming in had to write a check for $15,000 and give it to the tax man to pay the interest on the debt that year, how many stadiums would we need to do that? The answer is 540 AT&T stadiums filled to max capacity with everybody writing a check for $15,000. Think about that. Think about how big that is and how many people we're talking about. And it's just 1 year, and I think it's way short of what it should be. So that's part of my argument. Now, the sad part about this is it's going to fall back on us, guys. We are the majority of the money the United States collects. And this is what I believe is going to happen. I think it's going to be some unfortunate administration down the road. We don't know who it can be at this point. But there's going to be a sobering conversation with the United States people, and it's going to say, we have to raise taxes considerably in order to maintain our obligations that those bad guys did many, many years ago, right? And that conversation might just happen when I turn 65 years old. And what happens then? So what happens if I have to give more of the monies that I've saved all my life? What happens if inflation also follows that? Where do I go? What do I do in my retirement? Do I give up all my years of hard work because I wasn't aware of what's happening right now? I don't want that for you, and I'm hoping that this effort that we've been doing nationally is going to help some people start packing their bags a little bit differently when it comes to retirement. Okay, so I talked about the second part, right? So we had Hurricane Grace, and then we had that nor'easter, right? That thing that suddenly grew and got so powerful. So in my analysis here, I'm saying that in the retirement perfect storm, we're talking about the bubble, right? What will fuel that financial perfect storm? It's a bubble. It's an expanding stock market. And I don't know how to get people to understand this. So many people that come through our program every day really believe that this can keep going and going and going. Oh, we'll just keep printing more money. It doesn't work that way. What happens is we form bubbles, and bubbles break. And people that get hurt when bubbles break have a behavior issue, and that's the third part of the storm. So let's go over this. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 2010, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, was at 11,577. Those are points, not dollars, right? So that was the Dow Jones Industrial Average just over 10 years ago. When I checked on 12/31 this year, it was at 30,606. So that's a 10-year period. Now, here's how much that grew. You're looking at a 264% increase when you look at those numbers. That is massive. It more than doubled, right? That's a double and a half. That is a bubble, right? So how do I know it's a bubble? There has to be something more than an opinion. There has to be facts. Remember, I told you I'm not going to try to push my opinions on you. I want to feed you facts, and I want you then to say, okay, I've been exposed to this. Now what do I do? So if this is true, how do we prove it? This is how we prove it. I am a huge fan of the Shiller PE ratio, it's called. I check it all the time. I find it fascinating because it tells us when bubbles happen, right? How do bubbles grow? Well, this is an indicator of bubbles. So when I checked this on January 6th, and I think this number's actually off, I think it's more like 37 times. So the Shiller PE ratio on the S&P, which is the 500 bellwether great stocks in the United States in the market, was at 34.2. Let's just go with that number because it really doesn't matter. I think it was more like 37. So when did that last happen? So if you drew the line across from the 34 and you go across, you're going to bump into 2000, right? Because it was going up and then it came back down. So it kind of crossed twice. So on its way up, the last time it happened was 2000, not even 2008. But if you go back further, now remember, this is how many more times. If anybody was on my last webinar, I used my wood truck as an example, right? It made an impact. A lot of people joked around with that, which is why I did it. I thought it was really cool that people got the humor there. But when was the last time that the market was this inflated? When really did this happen last? Black Tuesday, guys, was the beginning of the Great Depression. That is the last time when we let caution go to the wind. We bought the stocks because we had to. There was so much opportunity. Look at the growth that went into from 1920 to the 1929. What happened in there? Well, that's the last time we've had the conditions the way they are today. So if you're excited about that 401k statement and you keep looking at that number getting bigger, picture it being written on a balloon instead of a piece of paper, and understand that that thing could just pop and be a bunch of, fabric in your hand. So let's go ahead and talk about other crashes, modern day crashes, and how they were, because we lose sight of this. So this is a slide that I've used so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. So what I want to talk about is growth. We're in this because we want growth. We're always pursuing growth. I told a story. I have a fat squirrel in my yard, and we put out peanuts, unsalted peanuts for you wildlife fans. We put out peanuts, and we'll put out some acorns, and we'll put out different things for these squirrels. Now, the reality is these squirrels, there's two of them, they have so much food put away that they can't possibly eat it if they stayed up all winter long. But they're out every single day, and they start as soon as the sun comes up, and they'll go until the sun goes down. But I have this big old hawk that flies across my yard quite often. And the tragedy that can happen to these squirrels is their behavior is to keep getting nuts, keep getting nuts, keep getting nuts. But one day I fear that they're getting so fat that the hawk is going to come down and take them away. So just think about that. So let's talk about that kind of mentality. So that drop of 2000 looked like what's in my circle there. It went pretty deep. We went down 47 I think I had that number here, sorry, 47.54%. That's how much we lost in the 2000 crash. But look at the period that it took. It took 7 years and 1 month. So if you took the amount of money and you didn't put more money in, you just took what you had, rode the market to the bottom, and by the time it got back up to where you had your money, it took 7 years and 1 month. Then we had a little period of euphoria. I got my money back. And then it did it again. It was a double crash. But again, if you look at it, and you look at it and from a financial advisor's perspective, they look like little blips, little years with red lines in them. This is telling you that if you're not making money in retirement and you go through a double barrel crash like this, This was 12 years and 6 months of no growth. That is not sustainable. That is not what you're using to plan your retirement, but it's a reality. This is what happens when bubbles burst. Not what happened with COVID. Let's look at COVID, right? So here's COVID. This was not a crash. I said it when it happened. I said to everyone, the V-shaped recovery is absolutely going to happen, and it doesn't matter how many people lose their job, how long the pandemic lasts, how many businesses go broke, how many homes will be lost. None of that mattered because we expected it to go away. We knew that it was a pandemic. We knew that it would go away, and we all believed, and that's a big part of this, that everything would go back to the way it is. It still isn't. We're still waiting for vaccines. We still have people, the numbers are horrific right now in my area, pretty much across the country. People are getting very sick. The hospitals are getting plugged full. The market's on a tear. We had a switch from a Republican Party to we had the blue wave, and the markets didn't care, right? So when we look at this, please remember that if your advisor ever tells you, if we start to see another drop in the markets, if they tell you, oh, don't worry, you're in it for the long haul, and look what happened when we had a world pandemic. The markets are so resilient that they recovered. Please don't let that be your only sounding board, because you will follow the markets to the bottom. And that brings me to the next part. How can the markets be so resilient? So let's think about this as far as a conveyor belt, right? So let's think about your 401k and the people that are working. So this is the conveyor belt without the chocolates. It's your money, and I call it the never-ending 401k contributions. So it doesn't matter. We are buy, regardless of things like corporate profits. What does it matter? Buy the market. Let's say PE ratios. We already know that we're up against one of the largest bubbles that burst and created one of the biggest depressions we've ever seen. What about bad news? My God, there's bad news, and the markets are just so resilient. They just keep plugging along. World pandemics, we just explained that, right? We had a world pandemic, not just a U.S. pandemic, and the markets hit new highs. Civil unrest. We have a lot of civil unrest in this country. The markets just keep ignoring it. It doesn't seem to matter what's going on. The market keeps hitting new numbers. The money just keeps coming in. It's not people buying the market because of opportunity. They're buying the market because there's no place else to put money. And it's not just the U.S. It's around the world. People are dumping money into this crazy market mentality, and that's why we have this bubble growing. The money's not there, guys. These companies are just not making enough money to justify that we keep buying them. So as long as that conveyor belt keeps going and going and going, the markets will keep, they'll keep hitting new highs, right? But it's like the game, it's like the musical chairs. I was looking for a graphic for that. Musical chairs was a game that kids played, and I see it still on some videos on YouTube. It's reality. That's what happens. If you're the person who's standing there believing that that conveyor belt doesn't slow down, it will slow down. And when it slows down, that may just be the pop that that bubble needs. And I do believe, again, I'm not saying this is coming this year. I'm not even saying it's coming next year. I just know it's coming. And what we need to do is think about how to do that. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like for you to think about this. I call it the bucket test. How are you going to be? Are you going to be resilient if the bubble breaks, if taxes go up, and inflation? Let's throw that in there too, right? If we want to really outdo the perfect storm, let's throw inflation in there. But for right now, let's just talk about this in a visual sense. Will your retirement savings last through your retirement years? Are you going too far with your need for more nuts? Is that what's happening in your world? So think about this. You've got buckets, right? So let's think about this as two buckets. So if you have the buckets, let's use an old rule of 100. These are things that have been forgotten on young investors, I should say young financial advisors, and our baby boomer generation. We lost touch with the rule of 100. The rule of 100 is very simple. You take your current age. So let's use somebody who's 60 years old. A lot of the ad respondents are in the 60-year range, be it 59 to 62. That's kind of our range that we have. So let's use 60 as a number. You take 60, your age, you subtract it from the number 100. So in this case, it's 40, right? So what does this tell us? What does the rule of 100 tell us? It tells us that we have to be thinking in two different buckets, and it changes as we get older. When you go to distribution in your life, you need to be thinking different than you were when you were 25 and 30 and you were accumulating money. So let's say we take this 40%, put it on the left-hand side. That's money that can be exposed to risk, let's say, and then 60% of the money is money that we should be protecting. So when we look at the 40%, and again, I've got it reversed because I don't believe most people will do the rule of 100. It's normally the other way around. You would be saying, okay, 40% could be at risk, 60% can be should be in the safe, right? No one's going to do that today. So I reversed the old rule of 100, but we still need a platform. So let's just talk about 40% of their money. It should be free of market risk. That 40%, if you can keep it and not lose it, that's going to give you a chance to weather out the retirement perfect storm if you need to. Just 40%. So what about tax smart distributions? You want to know that if that 40% is what you need, you should be able to get it out as efficient as you can. That's part of our blueprinting process. Principal guaranteed, hard to do. There are programs and there's concepts out there that can guarantee your principal. You should know about that. Reasonable growth, reasonable growth. We should expect growth. We shouldn't put our money where it can't do anything. We should be trying to get some growth, and there are concepts that can do this. What about legacy? I know that what we're leaving our children and our grandchildren, that idea that I hear from people all the time that I got my kids through college, it's up to them. They're on their own. I got them what they needed. That's not true. Not when we're sitting here soiling their future by letting a government get so out of control with its spending, by letting our money go into these bubbles because we just believe grow, grow, grow. We got to think about being smart to help our children, and we need to be tax smart when it comes to our legacy planning. And for that, I want you to think about your current cast of advisors in your life, right? You have the person or persons over time that have helped you accumulate wealth. Maybe you talked to them when the markets got really bad or when you got a promotion, or somehow you have someone in your life who's helped you on the growth side. If you picture it like a mountaintop, you've now, as you go into retirement, you get to the top of that mountain. Now you got to worry about getting down the other side. Well, you need someone else who's a little bit better skilled about the descent than you did on the rise. So let's look at that 60%. Now remember, the real number is reverse this. This should be the other way around. 60% of your money should be protected, but I know no one is going to do that. They wouldn't even do it at 50-50. So I'm just trying to incorporate what I believe we'll do if we're exposed to it. So smart growth, right? So on that 60%, be careful as you get older. Let's not go for broke. Let's have some rules. Let's establish your own contract with yourself. Let's go for some growth, but let's not go out for the risky stuff at this point. Set loss limits. This is really important. That conversation of you're in it for the long haul is something that I think everybody should be really thinking about as you get older. You're not always going to be in it for the long haul, so you should think about setting loss limits. Here's the problem with that, and it goes to my bullet on the left-hand side. If you are thinking about having two people, as a matter of fact, if you think about it, most corporations need three people. Why? Because two people don't always get along and have the same decision, right? They can have two opposite decisions, nothing gets done. This is the opposite. When it comes to behavior, when it comes to the markets, and again, this is a lot about behavior. When the markets start to slide and you're nervous, if the person you go to, the only person in your life, is the person who tells you, hey, you're in it for the long haul, look what happened during COVID, don't worry, the markets will return. Well, you're going to be staring at your 401k or whatever your investment statement is, and you're going to see the numbers are down. Guys, that is the behavior that I'm talking about. That is the third part of the financial perfect storm. It's behavior. It's the idea that if you see it on your piece of paper and it starts to go down, you're going to want it back. And the person that you have, if you only have one financial expert in your life and that person helped you get up, they're going to tell you what they also believe. You're in it for the long haul. Wait a minute, I'm 65 years old. How long is this haul? It's not what you want to hear. You need to have loss limits but you can't do that with someone who has the same behavior as you. That's why I believe all of you out there should be getting a financial expert in your life who's focused on distribution, who knows when you have enough nuts, who can protect you so that that behavior doesn't sink you, because it's going to be a problem. I promise you it will happen, because it's happened before. It happened in 2000. It happened in 2008. It happened in the Great Depression. People don't like to lose. So setting a loss limit sounds good. Try to do it when two people believe that you should stay in for the long haul. What about Roth conversions? Are we looking at the idea of doing Roth conversions? We're still waiting to see how that's going to be affected by what will be a new tax code coming out of Washington. How about planning to move money into the other bucket, right? Is there a plan to go into the other bucket if we're running into a retirement perfect storm? Is there going to be a strategy there? Are we leaving a door, a box, a safe, whatever you want to call it, in the other bucket so you can move the money if you become threatened by these losses that could come? Again, that's why I think you need that second person in your life. And most importantly, 100%, if you come up with a plan, you have to be willing to stick to it. It's a contract you should make with your spouse, your family, yourself. You should say, this makes sense to me. I can't risk everything I've gathered to this point. You've done really well. You've had 12 years of winning hands in the casino. It's time to think about that 40%. That's the pocket where you put the money in when you're having a good day at the casino. If you allow yourself to be watching what you had, and again, it's a greedy thing, too many nuts. If you do this, you are going to likely follow the markets to the bottom. And guys, if that's 12 years, if I'm 65 and I find myself in this plunge pool with another one to follow potentially, or just be one big, deep, wide one, 12 years when I'm 65, I'm 77 years old. Am I really going to want to spend that much time waiting for my money to come back? Because I won't want to spend it. If I spend it, it never has a chance of coming back. And there'll be people that'll take it out in their RMDs in a loss, and they'll take it and put it right back in the markets. This is the potential of the retirement perfect storm. And I believe this wholeheartedly. I'm not making any recommendations. I never do that. That's not my job. My job is I've attracted your attention. I hit a chord inside you that made you do something you don't always do. You went to a website. You put in information. You're looking for some help. This is now a rule. Tomorrow, I will be training this to 700 advisors across the United States.